The 369th Infantry, an all-black regiment from New York immortalized as the Harlem Hellfighters, firmly stood as the last line of defense between advancing German forces in Paris. At the time, no other African American regiment garnered as much attention or praise, but they still faced explicit racism and little positive social change. The 369th was the first regiment of African Americans to deploy overseas during World War I. The unit spent 191 days in frontline trenches. They also suffered the most losses of any American regiment with 1,500 casualties, more than any other American unit. The regiment was also the first of the Allied forces to cross the Rhine into Germany. The 369th never lost a foot of ground, nor had a man taken prisoner. The 369th served as a useful window into the limitations of racial change in this era. With the onset of the war, many African Americans saw this as their opportunity for success, demanding that American society pay the price of educating blacks and extending equal rights. Around this time, the military was very racist, and the army was unwilling to allow black soldiers to integrate into white units desperate for manpower. Army officials turned away many black men who were eager to serve. When the United States realized that it did not have enough soldiers, it decided to pass the Selective Service Act of 1917, which required all men, including African Americans from the ages of 21 to 30, to register for the draft. White conscripts got plenty of preferential treatment. Of all the black men classified for the draft, 51% were labeled as Class 1, the most likely to be conscripted. When compared to the 32% of whites placed in this category, it is clear that the all-white draft boards took greater sympathy for their white peers. Additionally, the draft board in Fulton County, Georgia exempted 526 of 815 whites and only 6 of 200 African Americans. From a larger perspective, in 1918, African Americans made up 10.7% of the American population, yet accounted for 13.08% of those drafted. Despite the blatant mistreatment, African American leaders preached for cooperation. W.E.B. Du Bois pointed to fascism as the greatest opponent to black liberty, claiming that what the German power represents today spells death to the aspiration of Negroes and all darker races for equality, freedom, and democracy. Despite some protests, most African Americans sided with Du Bois, and an exceptional enthusiasm rose from black universities. A community of Howard undergraduates, for instance, felt that the war was an opportunity for the African American race to prove its worth, particularly the worth of its educated leaders. The 369th Regiment was reformed from the National Guard's 15th Regiment in New York. Of the 170 officers of the 15th, only 5 of them were black. This number of black military leaders was the norm during the First World War. In fact, though 400,000 black soldiers served throughout the war, barely 1,200 of them served under black officers. This disparity was not because of a lack of qualified men, but rather because of systemic discrimination. All black soldiers faced discrimination, and the 369th escaped the worst of it. Conditions at Camp Hill in Virginia proved fatal for other black soldiers, as the Army crammed up to 18 black soldiers in one tent in the middle of the winter, while whites enjoyed a full barracks. The fully staffed hospitals were closed to blacks, causing many soldiers to die of disease and maltreatment. During the war, over 400,000 black soldiers served in the Army. The vast majority of these men performed manual labor, with no more than 42,000 of them engaged in combat. Upon arrival in France, the 15th New York proved no exception, as the men built docks, erected hospitals, laid railroad track, constructed a dam, and guarded a German prison camp. While the French had their own racial struggles, white French soldiers had far less trouble fighting with black soldiers because of their colonial experiences in North Africa. Among the first men killed in World War I were black soldiers from Senegal and Sudan. Black American soldiers did not object to their absorption into French lines since the French were much better equipped than Americans. In addition to superior clothing, the men were also issued 2 bottles of wine a day. Furthermore, many men of the 369th hailed from Louisiana and spoke French, accelerating the acculturation of the regiment. Their relationship with the French was so good it actually angered American commanders, and the French were given instructions to not treat blacks too kindly around white Americans. The events of July 15, 1918 made these comments regrettable, as the 369th firmly held their lines while the Germans broke through and engaged in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Additionally, the 369th earned its greatest honor on September 26th at the Maison on Champagne. The 369th performed well in heavy fighting, though they sustained severe losses. The unit captured the important village of Seychelles. At one point, the 369th advanced faster than French troops on their right and left flanks and risked being cut off. By the time the regiment pulled back for reorganization, it had advanced 8.7 miles through severe German resistance. For this battle alone, the regiment received the highest award in French military,
Croix de Guerre.
Additionally, 171 soldiers received individual citations for their honorable service. In mid-October, the regiment was moved to a quiet sector in eastern France, where it was stationed there on the 11th of November, the day of armistice. 6 days later, the 369th made its last advance on the 26th of November and reached the banks of the Rhine River, and became the first Allied unit to do so. The regiment fought in the trenches for 191 days, breaking sparingly for a total of only 2 weeks of that 6-month period. Of the 2,100 men who served in the regiment, 1,500 were either killed or wounded in combat. Training reinforcements during such heavy fighting was nearly impossible, and many fresh boots were thrust into action with little preparation. For much of the time the 369th was at the front, they stood as the primary force between the advancing Germans and Paris. The nickname Men of Bronze was given to the regiment by the French after they had witnessed the gallantry of the Americans fighting in the trenches. Legend has it that they were called Hellfighters or Hohenkampfer by the German enemy, although there is no documentation of this, and the moniker may have been a creation of the American press. Perhaps the most celebrated man in the 369th was Private Henry Johnson. Hailing from Albany, New York, he earned the nickname Black Death for his actions in the combat in France. In May 1918, Johnson and Private Needham Roberts fought off a 24-man German patrol, though both were severely wounded. Johnson instructed Roberts to warn the French units of the approaching patrol, but Roberts returned to him after the Germans opened fire on their position. Johnson instructed Roberts to warn the French units of the approaching patrol, but Roberts returned to him after the Germans opened fire on their position. They battled together until a German grenade incapacitated Roberts, at which point Johnson made it his mission to hold the line and protect his fellow soldier. After they expended their ammunition, Johnson battled with the grenades, then the butt of his rifle, and finally with the bolo knife. Reports suggest that Johnson killed at least 4 German soldiers and might have wounded 30 others while sustaining at least 21 injuries. He was the first American soldier to earn a
Croix de Guerre.
Theodore Roosevelt Jr. would later call Henry Johnson one of the 5 bravest men in the war. Despite frequent attempts, Henry Johnson was refused the Congressional Medal of Honor. On February 17, 1919, the regiment returned home to praise and camaraderie. The regiment's commanding officer, with the help of the former mayor, gave his men the opportunity to show the city their accomplishments and the city a chance to show their pride in these Harlem heroes. They were given a parade of Fifth Avenue in New York City, receiving applause and cheers from hundreds of thousands of onlookers. Even Henry Johnson reports being given $600 just by admirers. Unfortunately, this praise was short-lived. African Americans joined the war effort under the impression they would be advancing their equality back home. It was for this reason that men like Du Bois called for black men to close ranks and to participate in the war. They believed the war in Europe was only a small battle in the long war for equal treatment under law. This was sadly not the case. Their participation did see race relations slightly improve for a while. There was one such instance of white people defending a black soldier from getting kicked off of a bus. Unfortunately, these instances were not the norm. The more common response is epitomized in the signs whites posted on the homes of black soldiers in Pittsburgh proclaiming the war is over and Negroes must stay in their place. Many Americans quickly forgot the heroics demonstrated by black soldiers. In 1925, General Robert Lee Bullard wrote in his memoirs describing black soldiers as depraved rapists and cowards. The NAACP quickly condemned him, as did white New York Congressman Hamilton Fish, who served as a captain in the 369th. Fish's experience with black soldiers in France caused him to become a vocal supporter of blacks in the military. In 1938, the congressman drew up 3 separate bills aimed at improving the condition of blacks in the military. None of the bills ever came to vote. Racial attitudes also softened among some military officials. A 1924 survey of instructors at the Army War College demonstrated these changing attitudes. When asked if African Americans should participate in combat organizations rather than simply perform manual labor, 76 responded favorably, while only 8 opposed. The actions of the military failed to reflect these changing attitudes as the Army demobilized black combat units and awarded competitive positions in the Army to a higher percentage of whites than ever before. Black soldiers faced extreme difficulties in integrating into peacetime America. Many slowly faded away as the Veterans Administration did not exist until after World War II. No mechanism was in place to help soldiers deal with the post-traumatic disorders that affect soldiers returning from combat. Henry Johnson died in Albany at the age of 32 from alcoholism, estranged from his wife and 3 children. Unfortunately, this was a common fate experienced by black soldiers. The tragic failure of the war to catalyze change for black Americans is perhaps best epitomized by the attitudes of W.E.B. Du Bois, who after the war no longer called for blacks to march shoulder to shoulder with whites or to close ranks and willingly lift our eyes to the hills. Du Bois traveled to Europe following the war to attend the first Pan-African Congress. Du Bois was energized by the meeting but grew furious at hearing the countless cases of ill treatment experienced by black American soldiers. Du Bois fumed, "They cheat us and mock us, they kill us and slay us. They deride our misery. When we plead for the naked protection of the law, they tell us to go to hell. To your tents, O Israel, and fight, fight, fight for freedom." The 369th Regiment's story of immense bravery and sacrifice was kept largely in obscurity. In 1940, the United States Department of War arranged for the 369th Regiment to be renamed the Colored Infantry. This was effectively the first step in abolishing the regiment. Supporters of the regiment swiftly objected to the introduction of racial identity in the title of a unit in the United States Army, effectively preserving the regiment's reputation. However, eventually all African American U.S. Army units were renamed as colored. In the 369th served in World War II as the 369th Coast Artillery Anti-Aircraft Regiment, colored, with its successor being the 369th Infantry Regiment, colored. While the name wasn't outright removed, they were permanently branded with a title that discredited the group's sacrifice. The onset of World War II and the emergence of black soldiers such as the Tuskegee Airmen caused the story of the Harlem Hellfighters to be largely forgotten in the annals of history. In more modern times, the Harlem Hellfighters have gained well-deserved recognition. In June 1996, Henry Johnson was posthumously awarded the Purple Heart by President Bill Clinton, as well as the Distinguished Service Cross in February 2003. Nearly 100 years after his service, in May 2015, Johnson was finally awarded a Medal of Honor presented by then-President Barack Obama. The president said, The least we can do is say, we know who you are, we know what you did for us, we are forever grateful. On September 29, 2006, a 12-foot high monument was unveiled to honor the 369th Regiment. This statue is a replica of the monument that stands in France. The monument is made of black granite and contains the 369th crest and rattlesnake insignia. Most recently, in August 2021, the 369th Division was awarded a Congressional Gold Medal in recognition of their bravery and outstanding service during World War I. The Harlem Hellfighters remind us both of what is great and tragic about American history, a reminder of the greatness of self-sacrifice and the tragedy of missed opportunities. Thank you.